even though I can't see your beautiful faces, I can see more than I would see if I was preaching online. Now it looks like I'm going to be preaching with a mask on, so bear with me. The title of this sermon is called "Sometimes Bad Weed Falls on Good Seed." This spunky sermon title reminds me a bit of myself when I rediscovered God during the summer of 2007. I was doing soberly well, finding recovery from decades of substance abuse addiction. And then came a brief bout of colon cancer. I survived and rediscovered myself. I decided to rededicate my life to God. I found inspiration in having believers' baptism at the Uptown Baptist Church in Chicago on a very hot summer Sunday morning. I was dunked in the pool with the choir and the congregation watching by a short white Southern Baptist preacher man who was the senior pastor, who told me to lift my own self up out of the water. What a metaphor that is. That's when I became the good boy gone bad, gone good again. And now, look at me now. I'm a little rough around the edges, but still, my life has gained so much promise since that day. Well, most of us good Christians have either heard or read the parable of the sower and the seed. It's the story that Jesus taught to his disciples and followers, found in the beginning of Matthew chapter 13. In this passage, St. Matthew portrays this period following the commissioning of the 12 disciples as a time of questions and controversies that were swirling around Jesus. A time that was increasingly dangerous, opposition to his social justice work, as Jesus heals, feeds, gives life to, and brings good news to the poor. All of those with ears, let them hear. Jesus proclaims and tells his questioners to report all that they hear and see. But the issue that is becoming dangerously controversial is the non-observance of the Sabbath day. Last week was our first regathering service here at MCC Boston since the pandemic. And although it was wonderful to physically meet again here at the Old West Church, I feel like this is going to take some time to get used to. But in good time, we'll get there. Thanks to our very own Reverend Nancy Wickman, who blessed us with her own inspirational rendering of Jesus' message of the sower and the seed. An earthly story with a heavenly meaning, which gracefully reflects in detail some of the conflicts and discourse that can happen to God's good people along the way of their life's journeys. The story is hopeful that not all, but many of God's children will find a way to stay grounded in love, with their roots growing deep within God's humanity, which apparently will help us all to find our way into the kingdom of heaven. But sometimes along the way, bad weed falls on good seed. Our biblical word for today is parable, which comes from the Greek word parabole, meaning a placing aside, like a comparison or an illustration. A parable's most common use in the New Testament is to add visual life to the stories that Jesus drew from, that came from nature and the stories he made out of ordinary human life, that were used to portray spiritual or moral truths. Jesus' parables usually had a single main point to make, and not every detail was meant to have significance. To the people who resisted Jesus' messages, the parables often sounded like nothing more than interesting and perplexing riddles. Jesus was indeed a masterful storyteller, but he did not invent the parable. Other prophets, teachers, and Greek philosophers from ancient times studied and used this compelling technique as well. The synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke contain about 30 of these puzzling stories. But the Gospel of St. John, who was also known as the beloved disciple, contains no parables at all. None. The Gospel of St. John uses other figures of speech to make its point. Why Jesus used so many parables in his teachings to this day remains an intriguing mystery. Sometimes, clearly, he intended to help his listeners understand difficult spiritual ideas. When we read a bit further along in St. Matthew's chapter 13 about this famous parable, this time it goes a little bit deeper, which brings us to our gospel reading for today. It jumps around a little bit, but here Jesus has presented another parable to his disciples and to all of those followers that were gathered. Jesus proclaims in verse 24, that was read beautifully by Jonathan, "The kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who sowed good seeds in the field. And while everybody was asleep, the enemy came and sowed weed among that wheat, and then made off. When the crop began to mature and yield grain, the weeds became evident as well." So no matter which version of the Bible that you read from, the interpretation of the field represents the world. The seeds are us, God's obedient children, seeking God's love, truth, and righteousness. The weeds, they symbolize God's children who have lost their way and chosen to follow the evil sower. The evil sower represents the enemy. The weeds more than likely have derived from darnel seeds, a seed which is hardly identifiable from the wheat seed. The darnel seed produces a variety of plants that are called tares in some Bibles, our pre-modern day term for weeds. Just like wheat, when the darnel seed lands on good ground, it sprouts, it grows, and it has a wheat-like appearance when it is young. But when the darnel seed grows tall, it grows wild, and its grains can be distinguished as being that of a weed plant. These weeds can be beautiful, but also harmful, and have been reputed to be a slightly poisonous type of ryegrass. These weeds have never been a marketable product and contain no nutritional value whatsoever. In this story, these weeds have become a public nuisance to the Abba farmer, who has to figure out how to save the surviving good seeds from the challenges that the evildoer has deceitfully placed. As the story continues in verse 30, it parodies how God allows unbelievers to remain for a while, so that the surrounding wheat isn't foolishly uprooted with them. From the way that the story is told, you can perceive that there were many sacrifices and losses that were made along the way, as the people of the kingdom have no other choice but to live side by side with the people of the evil one, until the harvest of the field has finally arrived. The harvest can be figuratively interpreted as the final day of judgment. In other words, the rapture. At harvest time, the weeds will all be uprooted and thrown away. As it seems that we are living in the end of days, we are living in an age of mass murderers and mass shootings. Who knows why people do some of the evil things that they do? They try to cover up their crimes, but God sees them. God's harvest of all people is coming, and it appears to be coming soon. Will you be ready? Oh, it makes me thirsty. Living in this world, we know that it is impossible to completely separate the good from the evil individuals. Last week, while I was watching the nightly news of everything going on in the world, I suddenly turned off the TV to meditate in deep thought. When suddenly I challenged Google on my cell phone to give me an answer as to how do we as human beings live together in conflict. How do I phrase it? How do we respect each other's boundaries? So I eventually asked Google, does respect equal love? Google shot back something which read, and I quote, in a healthy relationship, you should have love and respect. However, they are not the same thing. While they do go hand in hand, it is possible to have one without the other. Respect means that you have a positive feeling or action that is shown towards another. And love is a feeling, but respect is something which is earned. Feeling love is not in our hands, but respecting someone is. And I said, wow, wisdom from Google? I was indeed impressed. The webpage did not say who wrote that nugget of knowledge, but it sure blessed me with what I needed in that moment. Now let's jump ahead to verse 36, where Jesus provides an apocalyptic interpretation of the weeds and the wheat parable in private to his 12 disciples, who had eagerly asked him for its deeper meaning. This part of the parable's central teaching is about how the growth and the spread of the gospel throughout the world is just as the tiny mustard seed that becomes a giant tree. Just as God's gospels have done, which began by starting out slowly, but has grown and grown over the centuries until it continues to nurture and flourish us up until the end of the world. The global existence of the Christian church represents a partial fulfillment of this prophetic word. The crux of the meaning in this chapter of parables is that there are true and false believers everywhere, even in the churches today. But we should be mindfully cautious in our judgments, because only Christ is qualified to make that final separation. When Jesus uses the terms of weeping and gnashing of teeth, the weeping indicates sorrow or remorse, with the gnashing of teeth being extreme anxiety and pain. Those who say they don't care about what happens to them after they die do not know what they are saying. They will be punished for living in selfishness and indifference to God. Some people ask me, and some even tell me, ugly things, like, it's not okay for me to be a queer Christian, or to be becoming an LGBTQ church leader. They want me to feel shame about who I am, and to believe that it's nice ministry work that I do, but I'm going straight to hell. Well, this is the kind of negative thinking and comments that chased me away from the church for so many years when I was young. And now I can strongly tell them that your limited mind may not fully be able to comprehend my way of life. I know that I was born this way. Queer people have always been a part of this world. And my Bible tells me that I am one of God's favorites. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Snap. I'm confident that I'm doing what God's Holy Spirit told me to do. No, I'm not perfect, but I am beautiful. My believer's baptism set me free of my dark past of self-deprecating pain and addiction. Yes, it's been a rough road of wretchedness, and I have the battle scars to show for it. I now believe that I may live in this world, but I am not of this world. I tell them, if you start judging others, you may damage some of the good plants, like me, that God has intentionally planted. And I almost got destroyed by the bad weeds. Because sometimes bad weed falls on good seed. But thankfully, God sends us angels who help us to find our way back into God's light. I find that it's more important to judge from your own personal experience to God than to analyze others' faults and responses. Those who receive God's favor stand in bright contrast to those who will receive God's judgment. I choose to do my best and to let God figure out the rest. Get that one. As in the words of our beloved late Congressman, John Lewis, I choose to have faith in humanity. I choose love over hate. I choose courage over fear. May it be so.